Welcome back to Tea and Table. I'm Annie, and this is episode 10 of my Board Game Design Diary podcast. So this is technically an anniversary that warrants a celebration. Woohoo! Okay, with the celebration out of the way, let's get started with a fun fact about tea. Did you know that only 2 countries, namely China and India, make up for more than half of the world's tea production? In fact, it's actually much more than half, and my own favorite type of tea, Darjeeling First Flush Black Tea, is also included in that. But with that, let's move on from the tea part of the episode to the table part. So in my last episode called Branching Out, I talked about branching out to working on more than one board game at a time. As I'm doing exactly that, I've been thinking about the various approaches you can take when coming up with a game idea. In that context, I commonly come across the mechanics first and theme first approaches, where mechanics first means that your initial idea was a specific mechanic and you then build a whole game around that mechanical idea. And of course, theme first means that you first thought of a specific theme and only then came up with the mechanics to support it and the rest of the game. Now, obviously, neither of these approaches is better than the other. They're just different. The key is that whatever comes later actually fits and ideally supports the initial core idea. Anyway, these 2 options, mechanics first and theme first, are usually the ones you see discussed, but I think they are only a few out of many, so let's take a look at where else you could start. A starting point I've used myself for my cooperative game about hacking, working title Infiltration, was a component first approach. I didn't consciously take this path when I first came up with the core idea for the game, but in hindsight I really did start from just an idea for a component. In this case, these were the tiles that form the network you are collaborating to hack into as part of the game. Notably, each of the tiles has a bunch of interconnected dots on it that represent network nodes you can move to as a player. Each tile has a different network topology, so the dots are connected in different patterns, and I just thought that looked like an interesting component to use in a game and started from there. Another option is experience first design, where you first define the experience you want players to have. What are the emotions the game should elicit? For example, while it's hard to know for sure where it started, The Mind is a game with a strong focus on experience, as players have to play numbered cards from their hands in real time and in ascending order, without talking to each other. Or at the other end of the spectrum, many of Ryan Lockhead's games have a strong focus on exploration and evoking a sense of wonder and discovery. One of the most prominent examples is Sleeping Gods, an open-world exploration game that lets you go almost anywhere on an open map. I think out of these 4 approaches, experience-first design and theme-first design are similar in that both can guide you and help you make decisions as you develop the game. When you have a new idea or decision to make, you can typically ask what would best support the theme or experience you're aiming for. On the other hand, mechanics-first and component-first approaches are less helpful when it comes to providing direction, except perhaps when they're extremely dominant and the single focus of the game. For example, when I started designing my hacking game based on the component idea I'd had, I first found it very difficult to find and stick to a specific direction. Only when I thought of hacking as a fitting theme for the tile component did I get a sense of the direction that I wanted to move into. But of course, this is going to vary from person to person. So something I haven't talked about on the podcast is what exactly I'm planning on doing with the games I'm working on. Generally, my current plan is to pitch them to publishers, aiming to find one to collaborate with. And in that context, I've been thinking about what's important to publishers beyond an interesting game idea and a functioning prototype. Obviously, I'm not a publisher myself, but if I were one, I think I'd have a strong focus on whether a game has a strong hook or USP, unique selling point. While board game sales have continuously grown over the past decade, I think the market is slowing down a little bit in the past couple of years. Inflation is also up in some countries, and board gamers are a bit slower to buy new games or to back crowdfunding campaigns. So ultimately, if I were a publisher, I'd be looking for games with a strong hook, for example, an intriguing elevator pitch, a game with great table presence that draws attention, gameplay that makes people want to come back, or a game that fills a specific underserved niche, stuff like that. So long story short, and big surprise, I actually have a point here, I think yet another interesting approach is hook-first design. I think my latest game ideas are a good example for this. One of them is a 1D dungeon crawler, and the other one is a board game adaptation of the concept of a 2D platformer or jump and run video game. Of course, whether something is intriguing is highly subjective, but to me, both of these ideas sound super interesting, and I would personally want to know more about them. Now, at this point, of course, some of the approaches blend together. A strong and specific theme can be a hook, just like an interesting new mechanic or a crazy component. Or a component could only be interesting because of a mechanic it enables. In the end, I think it's all about the core and focus of the starting point. Finally, I can see a couple more obscure ways to approach game design. You could start with just a title. You could have a specific story in mind. You may aim for a specific genre or a mashup of two genres. You could start from a specific interaction between players, or you could even start with the art. So these approaches would be title first, story first, genre first, interaction first, and art first design. As a side note, and on the latter point about art first design, there's actually a very interesting GDC talk about starting purely from an art style. GDC is the Game Developers Conference, and the title of the talk I'm referring to is Aesthetic-Driven Development, Choosing Your Art Before Making a Game. This is a talk about video games, but I think it's also interesting in the context of board games. So in summary, I think it's worth considering different approaches in board game design, and mechanics or theme-first design are not the only ways to go about it. With that, I hope you have an amazing week, and I'll talk to you next time.